Okay, so we've looked at managing your center of mass. Next up is your start position. So the ideas that we're going to talk about here are basically the same regardless of whether you're deadlifting sumo or conventional, but we're going to look at examples of both. The reason your start position is more important here rather than thinking about like the way you're moving as you go is because of the nature of the deadlift itself. So it's in the name of the lift, it is a deadlift. And what that means is the bar starts on the floor with no momentum, and you then have to stand up with it. So that removes the eccentric portion. So you have, as broadly, two sort of segments to a lift. You have an eccentric portion, which would be the lowering phase, and then a concentric portion. So if you imagine a bicep curl, the eccentric portion is the lengthening phase, the concentric is the lifting phase. So in a squat, the eccentric is as you go down, and the concentric is as you stand up, and the same in the bench. Eccentric to your chest, concentric to back to the start position. The nature of the deadlift is there is no eccentric loading. You walk up to the bar and you go straight into a concentric position or concentric contraction in order to pick that bar up off the floor. So that plays havoc on a few different areas. It makes managing your center of mass sometimes a little bit harder because you can't use the weight as feedback. And it really emphasizes the need to be in an effective start position because if you're not, your ability to apply force and tension in the barbell, into the barbell, will be drastically reduced. The nature of the start position is such that if you screw it up, it is going to have consequences pretty much all the way up the deadlift, and you're going to have a really hard time. Pretty much every issue in the deadlift relates somehow to your start position. It's either going to be you were in an ineffective position to start with, or that you had a mismanagement of your tension in that start position and therefore performed more poorly. So we're going to look at the conventional deadlift first. Here are two images. This is Nick, who trains with us, and he deadlifts conventional. So in a second, I'm going to show you a video of these two things, but we're going to look at some key markers in terms of what we're looking for in your start position. So much like the squat, the power in the deadlift is coming from the muscles of your legs and hips. And we need to be able to effectively transfer that into the bar. To do that, you have to have a strong and braced torso position, much like you do for the squat. And that's all about, like we said before, that link between or relationship between your rib cage and your pelvis. So, in terms of your back position, we're looking for a relatively neutral position. As indicated in both instances here, Nick has a pretty much a flat back position that looks pretty solid. The position of your feet, once you've figured out the width of your stance, so where you are side to side, like I said, for most people, it's going to be somewhere around hip width. Then, in terms of the pressure through your foot, we're really looking for basically the same thing as we are in the squat. It's that idea of a tripod foot. So, that connection between the knuckle of your big toe, the knuckle of your little toe, and your heel, giving you that three-pronged approach to being able to maintain your center of mass over your base of support. So often you'll find people in a deadlift are sort of too far back on their heels. Some people like talking about the deadlift as a seesaw, and that's a really ineffective analogy because that's not how your body produces force. So what ends up happening if you're too far back on your feet is you either can't get the bar off the floor, or you end up going to get the bar off the floor and your whole system has to shift forward. So we're really looking for that pressure to be through the middle of your foot. And for the most part, that means that you're as close as possible to the bar in your start position. So both sumo and conventional deadlifts, you really want that bar to be basically touching your legs the whole way up. You don't want it to rest on your thighs or anything like that, because obviously that's lapping. And it shouldn't really be dragging up your legs, but it should be pretty close to in contact with them the whole time. It's a pretty simple physics problem. If you take something heavy and you hold it with your arms straight out in front of you, you're going to find it much harder to hold than you are if you are holding it close to your body. The longer that lever is, the harder it is to lift. And effectively, what you're doing when you think about a deadlift, by having the bar further away from you, you're lengthening this distance from the power generators, the muscles of your hips, to the bar itself. So you're increasing the length of or the effective length of this torso line here, putting more stress through your lower back, and therefore you're just not going to be able to as effectively apply force. Shoulders and arms is the thing that we're going to look at here as sort of the indicator for what's gone wrong. In this image on the left, if we imagine that this marks somewhere in the middle of the shoulder, and this is not a perfect analysis because it's not taken from exactly the same spot, but you get the idea. This mark of the shoulder should be pretty much over the top of the bar. And what you can see here is that Nick's actually a little bit behind the bar. So instead of his center of mass being over the top of the bar, he's effectively slightly behind that. And that'll manifest itself in a change in position as the bar comes off the floor, which you'll be able to see in a second. In this second shot on the right here, Nick's shoulder is very much over the top of the bar. What you can see is, in order to facilitate that position, he's had to bring his hips up ever so slightly, and that's changed that angle of the torso marginally. Again, not the end of the world. It's not that we arbitrarily need you to be very upright here. It's about what position do we need to put your body in order to tick off these principles. So here the weight's in the middle of Nick's foot. His back is nice and flat and braced through the torso. And you can see that his arms are relatively perpendicular to the floor and pretty much straight over the top of that barbell. This is a really solid conventional deadlift position to start from. And if you can then be effective in the way you manage the tension application in that position, life's going to be really good. Now I'm going to have a look at a video of this in motion. This is orientated the same way. So this is the one on the left where Nick was a little bit too far behind the bar. And this is the one on the right where Nick was effectively over the top of the bar. Just have a look at how he moves as the bar comes off the floor here. It's very subtle. And if you missed it, that's okay. Watch it again and see if you can pick it. Let me actually press play. It lagged through it. Great. Here we go. So it's this little portion as Nick goes to apply force. So he's starting to pull there, and see how his hips actually rise quicker than his shoulders do, right? His torso angle effectively changes as he comes off the floor. That's a really great example of your body adapting to the demands of the task. So we've talked about this idea of your body being a self-organizing system, right? And so Nick's in a position here on the left where he goes to apply force and it's not particularly efficient. And so the system itself reorganizes into a more effective position. So you can see that tip forward. Now, this is a reasonably light weight for Nick. It's like 120. I think his best deadlift at the comp just before this was like maybe 150-ish, 160. And what you'll see here is something that he can get away with at this sort of weight, but it's the sort of application of force and start position that is going to long-term be detrimental to his lifting. What'll end up happening is he'll go to pull a weight that's at or above his max, and he'll go to pull and that shift will happen, and then he'll just stop. Now, if you watch this one on the right-hand side and watching for the same thing again, have a look and see if you can see the difference. We'll watch it again. So can you see there that Nick's hips and shoulders rise up together? So what that means for me is you're getting simultaneous movement from the hips and the knees, which is then going to mean that you're effectively transferring that force all the way through. It's going to feel easier generally. And I know this because I was doing the coaching at this point. Nick definitely found that one felt easier. For him, it felt a bit weird because it was different to what he was used to. But the change in this position was literally a matter of 30 seconds or so. All we did was have him think more about getting the weight through the middle of his feet and having his shoulders over the top of the barbell, and then just being nice and smooth in how he pulled it. And he ended up with this much cleaner, much smoother movement. Often, even if you're inexperienced at picking technical difficulties or technical breakdown, you can generally kind of get a feel for it by looking at the movement itself. Good movement and efficient movement looks like that, right? It looks smooth and consistent the whole way through. And what you'll find in your own lifting, especially if you do a lot of filming stuff, is often there'll be a correlation between the reps that feel a bit gross and feel less effective, and the ones that look a bit gross and feel and look a bit less effective in the video footage. So generally these little nuances to position can be hard to pick up, but as you become more experienced at both an understanding of what we're looking for and why, and b an understanding of what you look like moving in space, you'll get better at being able to pick these things, and then better able to analyze your own positions. So we're going to look at a similar example, but in the sumo deadlift. So Jono here is pulling sumo. In this one on the left, his shoulders are in front of the bar. So this is basically the opposite to what Nick was doing, where he was too far behind the bar and having to kick forward. And in Jono's case, he's actually too far in front of the bar here. And what that ends up doing is, as you can see, rounding over his upper back and really pulling the whole system forward. Now, in Jono's case, he was still able to get this lift off the floor, but it made that top portion of the lift much harder. So, like with the conventional deadlift, we want that weight in the sumo start position to be through the middle of your foot. We want your back to be relatively neutral and braced. We want your arms to be pretty much straight up and down, and your shoulders to be pretty much over the top of the barbell, which is what you can see here in this image on the right. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the video that goes with these images, but the same thing is basically what happened in Nick's deadlift, is what happened here. The different manifestation, though, in this case, is that as Jono went to pull, his upper back rounds forward and the whole system gets shifted forward, which means he then has to work much harder to get it back into the right position for his lockout. So, in terms of start positions, regardless of where your stance is going to be, we're looking for the pressure to be through the middle of your foot, your shins to be pretty much touching the barbell in your start position, your back to be relatively neutral and braced strongly, and your arms to be pretty much perpendicular to the floor with your shoulders basically over the top of the bar. If you can tick all of those boxes, you're in an effective starting position. Then it's about how you create and maintain tension, which brings us to our third and final portion for understanding the deadlift and effective training for the deadlift.